Hello everyone. This lecture is on culture, consumption and production. It is a part of your paper on media, culture and society. In this lecture, we will explore the contemporary trends in the cultural production and consumption through the concept of presumption. I'm sure you must be intrigued by the term presumption. I'm sure you'll explore more and more in detail when we go to the module. With the recent explosion of user-generated content online, the notion of consumption and production are regarded to be inadequate to explain this phenomenon appropriately. Therefore, presumption is a concept introduced by American author Alvin Toffler, through which the phenomenon of user-generated content online, such as YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc., has been analyzed. At the end of this lecture, you will be able to look at the notion of free or no-cost user-generated content online critically, which otherwise ostensibly gives a feeling of democratic or freedom. You will learn the urge of capitalism to enter into the phase of presumption to deal with inherent crisis it is laden with. So this lecture is going to give you an understanding of the broader economic factors, production and consumption. As American sociologist George Richter has argued that over the last few centuries, the economy of the first world countries, known as developed countries, and to a certain extent the third world countries, has been dominated by the consumerism. In its early phase capitalism, it was dominated by production in factories. From the beginning of Industrial Revolution, the Western economy is entirely defined in terms of industrial production. Production is seen as the center of society, but recently the focus shifted from production in factories to consumption, which, with the upsurge in shopping malls, Richter argues that over time consumption grew in importance that attracted scholars to define developed societies, especially the US, in terms of consumption rather than production. This dramatic shift took place in the US after the end of Second World War. The war in US meant a focus on production, especially of war material and machines. As a result, there was less emphasis on consumer goods. Richter says that after the war there was a boom in the mass production of consumer goods such as refrigerators, automobiles and many other. It was in 1960s when there emerged problems in heavy industries such as coal and steel. This led to an expansion of cathedrals of consumption such as indoor shopping malls, mega malls, fast food restaurants, Disneyland and many more. Consequently, there was a growth in marketing, advertising, branding and the like. Richter says things began to grow worse for American heavy industry, beginning with the oil crisis of 1973, the resulting rise led by the Japanese automobile industry, of the small car, and the beginning of the painful decline of the American automobile industry. Americans continued to consume, in fact, at an accelerating rate, but it was increasingly likely to be goods produced elsewhere, including and perhaps especially Japanese products such as automobiles and electronics of all types. The various elements associated with consumption continued their relentless expansion, as for example, America's cathedrals of consumption proliferated and new ones like Walmart, Mall of America, the reinvented theme like Las Vegas Strip emerged as the 20th century moved towards its conclusion. The cathedrals of consumption, the goods that is increasingly produced in China and services sold there, and the consumers who bought them had to a large degree replaced the factory at the heart of American economy and more generally American society. French social theorist Jean Baudrillard in his The Consumer Society had espoused the emergence and centrality of consumption. According to him, consumption is laying a hold of the whole of life. According to Richer, consumer society or consumer culture is not a phenomenon that describes the structure of consumer society. Instead, it draws our attention to the norms, values, and meanings associated with any society dominated by consumption. Richard says, whether it is called consumer society, consumer culture, or even consumer capitalism, is less significant than the fact that all of these ideas draw our attention to the increasing importance of consumption, especially related to production. It is close to Richard's own thesis of McDonaldization of society that applies the principles of fast food restaurant, McDonald's to other arenas of society. When it is said that consumption is increasingly becoming central, it does not mean that production is unimportant. Production still plays a key role in economy and society. In fact, without production, how can one think of consumption? It is just that the focus of the scholars has shifted from conditions of working class in factories and their exploitation in capitalist system to the growing manifestation of consumption, primarily through the culture industry. Richard says that it is hard to ignore the importance that is accorded to consumption. Richard further postulates that in late 2007, both consumption and production started declining due to the global economic recession. This decline attracted scholarly attention to the aspect of presumption. It is argued that consumer and producer or consumer society is beginning to be challenged in importance by what might be called prosumer society. Now let us discuss the concept of presumption. As Alvin Toffler introduced the notion of prosumer in 1980s, he defined it as the progressive blurring of the line that separates producer from consumer. This means it is a concept that does not focus either on production or consumption as two separate processes. It involves both production and consumption. With the upsurge of user-generated content online, presumption is a concept that becomes increasingly central. Toffler says that presumption is not a new phenomenon. For him, pre-industrial societies are characterized by a predominance of presumption, which he terms as the first wave. Thus, the primordial economic form is neither production nor consumption, rather presumption. The first wave was followed by a second wave when capitalism separated production and consumption. But now the society is moving towards third wave, where this aberrant separation of production and consumption is evaporating and giving rise to presumption. George Richter also argues in the similar tone that Industrial Revolution separated production and consumption. Richter discusses forms of presumption associated with Web 2.0, which is an advanced stage of development of Internet, marking a shift from static web pages and user-generated content and growth of social media, which is more dynamic compared to the earlier form of Internet. For him, it is a new phase of capitalism defined by the unique characteristics of the relationship between capitalism and presumption. It is argued that from capitalist system, it is becoming difficult to gain control over prosumers on Web 2.0. He refers to Web 2.0 as a crucial development of means of presumption. Examples of Web 2.0 include Wikipedia, where the content is continually generated, edited, and updated. Similarly, Facebook and other social networking websites where users create their profile, upload videos, images and photos, text and interact with one another, thereby creating communities as an example of Web 2.0. You may also include eBay and various other websites where consumers along with retailers create the market. YouTube, where mostly amateurs upload and download videos, is also a significant example. Similarly, Amazon.com, where consumers do all the work involved in ordering products and writing the reviews of those products, is a good example reflecting the user's buying habits. Google Map users fix errors of locations of business, upload photos, blog about their experiences with places on the map, thereby creating a virtual communities. GPS technology allows users to track where they are at a given moment. Presumption was clearly not invented on Web 2.0, but given the massive involvement in and popularity of many of these developments, it can be argued that it is currently both the most prevalent location of presumption and its most important facilitator as a means of presumption. Richter counts various factors to conclude that capitalism is transformed in the prosumer age. The first factor defines the unique character of capitalism is in prosumer age is the inability of the capitalist to control prosumers in the way they were able to control the earlier forms of producers and consumers. There is no doubt that Internet, that was the product of a military and administrative interest and has had various latent consequences which were unimagined. For instance, the Arab Spring, about which you must have read, is regarded to be spearheaded by social media such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and various blogs. In Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Jordan, Libya, and Bahrain, and other Arab countries, the digital social media became strongly imbricated in the people's movement. Similarly, there are instances when the internet and mobile services are blocked to impede social movements. These are the various usages of the services which were once implemented to further the security mechanisms. We have been constantly arguing about the uses of any technology that goes beyond its manifested functions. Along with resistance, exploitation is another factor that led the scholars to discuss the uniqueness of prosumer capitalism. Unlike the factory worker whose exploitation is overtly visible, the exploitation of prosumers is subtle. The idea that prosumer is exploited is first of all contradicted by the claims of the freedom that prosumers seem to be enjoying. In fact, it is seen as a choice. But scholars have argued that the work done by prosumers is an unpaid labor benefiting the capitalist interest. Let us look at case study to explain this. Prosumer labor in the context of Facebook. Connect with friends and the world around you on Facebook. Facebook's mission is to give people the power to share and make the world more open and connected. These are some of the catchphrases that give the feeling of democracy and freedom to individuals using Facebook. Corporate social media publish many of such positive promises. Christian Fuchs, the author of Digital Labor, argues that the work that users do on Facebook is nothing but a new form of labor called digital labor. Ridges says that capitalism has found a new way to expand by going beyond workers to prosumers to exploit and a new source of surplus value. Christian Fuchs says that presumption is actually a form of outsourcing work to users and consumers who do not need to be paid. Thereby, corporations are able to reduce their investment costs and labor costs. Going by these arguments, the exploitation of Facebook users would not make them die physically as in the case of the factory worker. It is rather a social form of coercion that threatens the user with isolation and social disadvantages. Facebook users' labor or presumer labor blur the boundaries between leisure and work, production and consumption. Dallas Smith, one of the Canadian scholars and also a political economy theorist, suggests that the social networking sites are actually a mechanism through which the audience commodity is sold to advertisers. This means that the data that users upload on Facebook in the form of photos, images, comments, profiles, friends lists constitute an audience commodity. But the unique feature involved here is that the fact that the users are the producers of this commodity, and this is why it is called Internet Prosumer Commodity. Online platforms like Google, Baidu, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Blogspot, LinkedIn allow different forms of usage such as searching, social networking, sharing and watching user-generated content, blogging, etc. When we refer them as social, what is meant is not that they are social and other forms of internet usage such as reading a book, article or news is non-social. As Christian Fuchs says, they rather imply a form of sociality focused on sharing, community and collaboration that is combined with information and communication. What all of these platforms have in common is that they use a business model that is based on targeted advertising and that turn users' data, that is content, profiles, social networks, online behavior into a commodity. The use, monitoring and commodification of user data is typically legally defined in terms of use and privacy policies. The terms of use and privacy policies enable the commodification of Internet prosumer. For example, Facebook Data Use Policy of June 2012 says we use the information we receive to deliver ads and to make them more relevant to you. This includes all of the things you share and do on Facebook, such as the pages you like or keywords from your stories and the things we infer from your use of Facebook. The Facebook Statement of the Rights and Responsibilities states for content that is covered by intellectual property rights like photos and videos, that is IP content, you specifically give us the following permission subject to your privacy and application of settings. You grant us a non-exclusive, transferable, sublicensable, royalty-free worldwide license to use any IP content that you post or in connection with Facebook, that is IP license. It is obvious that the ads are meant to promote certain commodities, irrespective of the fact that consumers may not get persuaded by these ads. It is for sure that ads try to shape the needs and desires of consumers in a certain way, and by signing up to Facebook, a user agrees to the privacy and the terms of use. We may generally skip reading the privacy policy, but it is mandatory for users to give their consent before proceeding to open the Facebook account. Thereby, we allow Facebook to use our shared experiences for economic benefits. Digital labor creates on social media the internet consumer commodity that is sold by internet platforms to advertising clients, which in return present targeted ads to users. And this crowdsourcing appears as democratization of capitalism. Through such legally binding agreements, the Facebook users are alienated from controlling their own experiences that they share online. The Facebook is granted the right to use the data that we share online, and this way an individual's subjective experiences are used for capital accumulation. So you can see that when we say Facebook does not exploit me because I'm benefited from it by connecting to other users, we are not realizing that the commodity character of the Facebook is hidden behind the social networking enabled by platform use. The impression that Facebook only benefits users socially is one-sided because it forgets that this social benefit, the social relations and the obtained visibility are at the heart of the commercial and corporate side of Facebook. It's exchange value and commodity dimension. Exchange value gets hidden in use value. The object side of Facebook hides itself in social relations. Christian Fuchs highlights one more interesting aspect of presumption, that is play ideology. According to him, play labor is a new ideology of capitalism. Objectively alienated labor is presented as creativity, freedom and autonomy, that is fun for workers. That workers should have fun and love their objective alienation has become a new ideological strategy of capital and management theory. Facebook labor is an expression of play labor ideology as an element of the new spirit of capitalism. You must have seen that those young people who are working in call centers take pride in the fact that they are provided the facility of gym, indoor games, cafe, etc. The political economy approach captures this phenomenon beautifully through the notion of play ideology. It is argued that at the imperialist stage of capitalistic development, the separation of work and leisure demolishes. The societal relations become a moment of relations of production. This means that the whole society lives as a function of the factory, and the factory extends its exclusive domination to the whole of society. Further, it is argued, when the factory raises itself to the master of the whole of society, the entire societal production becomes industrial production. Then the specific characteristics of the factory get lost inside of the general characteristics of society. The exploitation of internet users by Facebook and other internet companies is just one aspect of this transformation taking place in capitalist society. It signifies that private internet usage, which is motivated by play, entertainment, fun and joy, has become subsumed under capital and has become a sphere of the exploitation of labor. It produces surplus value for capital and is exploited by the latter so that internet corporations accumulate profit. Play and labor are today indistinguishable. On Facebook, play and labor converge into play and labor that is exploited for capital accumulation. Facebook therefore stands for the total commodification and exploitation of time. All human time tends to become a surplus value generating time that is exploited by capital. Let us look at an instance of user resistance. Couchsurfing.org was a non-profit organization which started in 2003 with the spirit of mutual aid. It works as a community of travelers who use this platform for finding places to stay overnight and to offer a couch or a room to travelers who come to their home cities. It is a community that is based on the idea of mutual aid in traveling and making traveling affordable. But in 2011, the couchsurfing.org was incorporated. It shifted from non-profit to for-profit. This change was questioned by couchsurfing community. They started an Avaz petition that called for returning the platform's control and ownership to the users. The petition said, "We, the community of couchsurfing, are the ones who built everything from scratch in voluntary work. As this community was giving such a high social reward to all its users, and as we won't just watch how this all is destroyed by the profit-seeking shareholders, we decided to fight for the future of our community and will do our best to put it back to the track of the user-based community it has been for a long time." This way, the users expressed their concerns on how their voluntary digital work is turned into digital labor, which is further exploited for profit use by private stockholders. They felt betrayed and exploited. In this lecture, you have learned the concept of presumption to understand the relationship between culture, consumption, and production. You have also learned that the capitalist economy is characterized by presumption after going through tremendous crises, World War II and 1973 oil crisis being the dominant. The concept of presumption challenges the euphoria of freedom and democracy generally used with regard to digital social media. The case study of Facebook was discussed to make you understand the theoretical arguments clearly. The political economy approach that primarily investigates these aspects of capitalism highlights that blurring of work and leisure through the concepts of presumption, digital labor, and play ideology. There are certain limitations of these concepts that one should be aware of. The concept of presumption does not at all discuss the conditions of workers working in ICT industry. Christian Fuchs can be credited for bringing in the analysis of the conditions of workers in Amazon and other ICT industries. You may read his work for further clarification. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. For more details, please read the modules carefully and attempt the questions given at the end of each module. Thank you.